The elevator had a habit of arriving before it was called, its doors already parted, as if it had been waiting, breathing softly through a narrow seam of fluorescent light. Every night, just before midnight, the building settled into a hush so complete it felt staged, like the pause before a verdict. The security desk clocks never agreed, but they all slowed as the minute hand approached 12, dragging time behind it. That was when the button panel flickered, and a number appeared that didn't exist on any blueprint, lease agreement, or fire escape plan. It wasn't the number that unsettled him at first. It was the certainty. The way the elevator didn't hesitate. The way it chose its moment with ritual precision. As if the building itself were holding its breath, he had watched the footage back frame by frame. People stepping inside with the posture of those expecting nothing more than a quiet ride down, their reflections briefly doubling in the stainless steel walls. Then the doors closed. The counter ticked. The car descended past the lobby, past the basement, past the last labeled floor, and stopped. When the doors opened again, the camera showed only light spilling onto an empty threshold. The car hollowed out like a shell. The report said glitch, fatigue, data corruption. But the logs were meticulous, almost proud of their consistency. Every entry was identical. Same time, same duration, same impossible destination, and the building, tall and glassy by day, felt different at night, less like a place of work, and more like a machine running a private process. Air vents whispered in patterns, hallway lights dimmed in pairs. Somewhere deep inside the shaft, cables tightened with a sound like knuckles cracking. At 11:59, the guard stood alone in the lobby, the polished floor reflecting him back as a smaller, darker version. When the elevator chimed, it sounded less like an invitation and more like a summons. He stepped forward, aware of the cameras, aware of the rules, aware of how easily a man could vanish between one floor and the next without anyone noticing the exact moment he was gone. As the doors slid shut, the lights above him flickered, and for a split second, his reflection smiled when he did not. The first anomaly revealed itself quietly, the way most important things do, hidden beneath routine and repetition, until someone noticed a rhythm that did not belong. The night shift security guard had been assigned to the building long enough to trust its patterns, to recognize the difference between a normal mechanical hiccup and something that deserved attention. Every system in the tower spoke in data, and over time, he had learned their language well enough to hear when a word was out of place. It began with a maintenance alert that didn't trigger an alarm, only a soft flag in the elevator activity log that appeared at the end of his shift like an afterthought. One entry, time stamped precisely at 12:00 a.m., listed a completed trip that made no sense, originating from a mid-level office floor and terminating at floor 13, a designation the building officially did not have. At first, he assumed it was a numbering error, the kind that occurred when older software was retrofitted to newer systems. Many buildings skipped the number 13 for superstition or branding, renaming it something more palatable, and he figured the elevator database might still recognize a phantom label buried deep in its code. But when he referenced the architectural plans stored in the building's digital archive, there was no trace of it. The floors ran cleanly from 12 to 14, the gap erased so thoroughly that even the emergency stairwell schematics showed no interruption. The absence was deliberate, not cosmetic, and that detail unsettled him more than the glitch itself. Curiosity, once awakened, refused to remain passive. He pulled older logs, scrolling backward night by night, watching the same entry appear with unnerving consistency. Always at midnight, always the same duration, always the same non-existent destination. The elevator did not report an error, did not stall, did not require reset. According to the system, it completed its journey perfectly, as if obeying a rule written somewhere outside the visible parameters of the building. The guard felt a subtle pressure building behind his eyes as he stared at the screen, the kind that came from trying to reconcile two truths that refused to coexist. Either the logs were lying, or the building was doing something it should not be able to do. He checked the call button records next, expecting to find an unauthorized input, maybe a prank or a stuck panel registering a false press. There was nothing. No call from any floor, no internal selection recorded from within the car. The elevator, according to its own memory, had decided to move on its own. That detail transformed the situation from a technical curiosity into something more intimate and more threatening. Machines were not supposed to make choices. They responded. They executed. They failed predictably. This felt different, as if the building had developed a habit it repeated with ritual discipline. As the nights passed, the guard found himself adjusting his routine to be present when the clock approached 12. He told himself it was for documentation, for clarity, but a quieter voice beneath the reasoning admitted something else entirely. He wanted to see it happen. On the fourth night, he stood near the elevator bank with his radio muted and his eyes fixed on the indicator panel. The building around him seemed to anticipate the moment, lights dimming imperceptibly, the air cooling by a degree or two. When the clock ticked over, the elevator chimed softly, and the indicator changed, the usual numbers giving way to a brief flicker before settling on the forbidden designation. The doors opened and closed without a passenger entering or exiting, the movement smooth and efficient. The guard felt a strange disappointment, as if he had expected the building to explain itself, to offer a glimpse behind the curtain. Instead, it behaved like a professional, completing its task and returning to standby mode. Yet when he checked the log immediately afterward, the entry was already there, neatly filed, indifferent to his scrutiny. It was then he noticed a new detail, one so small it might have been overlooked by anyone less attentive. The duration of the trip matched the exact time it would take to reach a floor that did not exist vertically within the building's height, as if the elevator had traveled somewhere that could not be plotted on a simple up and down axis. That realization reframed everything. If the elevator was not going higher or lower, then the journey implied a different direction entirely. The thought lingered uncomfortably, coloring his perception of the building during daylight hours. He began to notice architectural oddities he had previously dismissed. Walls that felt thicker than necessary, service corridors that ended too abruptly, blueprints that referenced revisions without explanation. It was as though the structure had been designed to conceal not a room or a floor, but a function, something meant to operate unseen and unquestioned. By the end of the week, the guard had compiled enough evidence to justify escalating the issue. Yet he hesitated. There was a private quality to the discovery, a sense that involving others too soon might disrupt whatever fragile equilibrium existed. He feared that scrutiny would provoke the building into silence, that the anomaly would vanish the moment it was officially acknowledged. And beneath that fear was another, more difficult to articulate, the suspicion that the elevator's nightly journey was not an error waiting to be fixed, but a process completing itself exactly as intended, one that had been happening long before he noticed and would continue whether or not anyone chose to look at it. The next layer of unease unfolded when the guard turned to the surveillance system, expecting clarity and finding instead a deeper distortion of what he thought he understood. Cameras, after all, were meant to be impartial witnesses, recording events without interpretation or emotion. He trusted them more than logs or reports, because they showed what actually happened, not what a system believed had happened. Late one night, with the building wrapped in its after-hours stillness, he cued the footage from the first recorded anomaly and watched the elevator lobby feed in silence, his finger hovering over the pause button, as if he might need to stop time itself. The image showed a young man in business attire approaching the elevator just before midnight, his posture relaxed, his attention fixed on his phone. Nothing about him suggested fear or anticipation. He moved with the absent-minded confidence of someone ending a long workday. The elevator doors opened promptly, light spilling onto the polished floor, and the man stepped inside without hesitation. The doors slid shut, sealing him into the reflective interior, and the guard waited for the moment he expected to follow, the doors reopening on the lobby level as the man exited and disappeared down the corridor. That moment never came. Instead, the feed cut to the elevator interior camera, showing the man standing alone as the indicator above the door flickered. As the car began its descent, the man's reflection multiplied in the mirrored walls, a visual echo that made it difficult to tell where his real body ended and the reflections began. He shifted his weight, glanced at the panel, and frowned slightly, as if noticing the unfamiliar symbol appear where a number should have been. There was no visible panic, only a brief tightening around the eyes, the subtle expression of someone registering that something was not quite right. Then the elevator slowed. The footage stuttered for a fraction of a second, a digital hiccup that might have gone unnoticed if the guard had not been watching so closely. When the doors opened again, the interior camera showed only the empty car, its lights humming softly, the floor pristine and unmarked. There was no sign of struggle, no blur of sudden movement, no indication that a person had been there moments before. The lobby camera showed the same thing from another angle, the doors parting to reveal nothing at all. The man had not exited, had not collapsed, had not been dragged from view. He was simply gone, removed from the sequence as cleanly as a deleted frame. The guard felt a chill crawl up his spine, the kind that came not from fear, but from the violation of logic. He reviewed the footage again, slower this time, then frame by frame, searching for anything that might explain the disappearance. Compression artifacts, camera blind spots, timing discrepancies. He considered them all, ruling each out with growing unease. The transition from occupied to empty happened between frames, not during them, as if the cameras themselves had skipped over the event. He pulled footage from other nights, other incidents, and found the same pattern repeating with unnerving precision. Different people, different faces, different clothes, but the same outcome every time. They entered alone, the doors closed, the elevator moved, the doors opened. The car was empty. What disturbed him most was what did not appear in the recordings. There were no signs of alarm, no frantic pounding on the doors, no sudden gestures of resistance. The people did not behave like victims. They behaved like participants who reached the end of their part in the process. In one clip, a woman adjusted her hair in the mirrored wall as the elevator slowed, her expression momentarily curious rather than afraid. In another, an older man sighed, the way someone might when bracing for an inconvenience. And then the footage jumped forward to an empty car. The absence of fear felt intentional, as if the elevator exerted some quiet influence that smoothed panic into compliance. As the guard compiled these recordings, he noticed a detail that tightened the knot in his chest. None of the individuals were ever seen again on any camera in the building. There were no exits recorded, no stairwell appearances, no after-hours badge scans. It was as though their presence had been neatly excised from the building's ongoing narrative. Even more unsettling, when he checked tenant records and access logs, he found that several of the names associated with those faces no longer appeared in the system. Not marked as inactive or terminated, just absent, as if they had never been registered at all. The surveillance system itself began to feel complicit, less like an observer and more like a collaborator. On 2 occasions, he noticed brief moments of visual distortion just before midnight, a subtle warping at the edges of the frame that resolved itself as soon as the elevator completed its unexplained trip. It was enough to suggest that the cameras were not merely failing to capture what happened, but actively adjusting to avoid it. The idea that the building could influence its own records, shaping what could and could not be seen, unsettled him more than any supernatural explanation. By the time dawn crept through the glass facade, washing the lobby in pale light, the guard felt as though he had witnessed a crime without a perpetrator or a victim, only an absence where a person used to be. The footage did not scream or accuse. It simply presented a reality that refused to be interrogated, a sequence of events that ended in emptiness. He shut down the monitors and sat in the dim glow of the security desk, aware that whatever was happening inside the elevator was not chaotic or accidental, but orderly and repeatable, and that the cameras, designed to reveal the truth, had instead confirmed something far worse by showing nothing at all. By the time the guard decided to ride the elevator himself, the choice felt less like bravery and more like inevitability, as if the decision had been made somewhere ahead of him, and he was only now catching up to it. The nights had begun to blur together, each one orbiting the same fixed point at midnight, and he realized that observation alone had changed him. Watching people vanish without resistance had stripped away his certainty that distance equaled safety. He knew that if he did not enter the elevator willingly, some part of him would remain suspended in that moment forever, staring at screens and wondering what it felt like on the other side of the doors. He prepared with the quiet rituals of someone pretending preparation mattered. He checked his radio battery, adjusted his uniform, logged his intent in the system using neutral language that disguised the truth even from himself. The building responded with its usual indifference, lights humming, vents breathing, the polished surfaces reflecting him back in fragments. As 11:59 approached, his heartbeat began to synchronize with the ticking clock, each second landing heavier than the last. He stood before the elevator bank, noticing how the stainless steel doors seemed darker than usual, less reflective, as though absorbing light rather than returning it. When the chime sounded, it was softer than he expected, almost courteous. The doors slid open and the interior greeted him with an unsettling familiarity. The same muted lighting, the same faint smell of metal and cleaning solvent. He stepped inside and turned to face the doors, resisting the urge to look at his reflection in the mirrored walls. As the doors closed, sealing him into the small, humming space, he felt the first genuine flicker of fear, sharp and immediate, quickly followed by a strange calm. Whatever happened next would at least be experienced rather than inferred. The panel did not respond when he pressed the lobby button. Instead, as the clock on his wrist ticked over to midnight, the indicator above the door flickered and resolved into the same impossible designation he had seen in the logs. The elevator began to move, but the sensation was wrong. There was no familiar pull of ascent or descent, no gentle shift in balance. It felt instead like standing still while the world slid sideways, the air thickening as if the car were passing through something viscous and unseen. His ears popped, then rang, then settled into a low, continuous tone that vibrated behind his eyes. The lights dimmed, not enough to plunge him into darkness, but enough to change the quality of the space. Shadows gathered where there had been none, clinging to corners and seams. When the elevator slowed, it did so without the usual deceleration, stopping abruptly, as if it had reached a boundary rather than a destination. The doors hesitated for a fraction of a second before opening, and in that pause he became acutely aware of his own breathing, loud and intrusive in the confined space. What lay beyond the threshold looked at first like a mirror of the building he knew. The same hallway, proportions, the same polished floor, the same recessed lighting. But the resemblance unraveled the longer he stared. The surfaces were wrong, aged in ways that suggested neglect rather than time, the floor scuffed and cracked, the walls stained with water damage that spread like old bruises. The lights flickered irregularly, some buzzing loudly, others barely glowing, casting the corridor in uneven bands of yellow and gray. The air smelled damp, heavy with something metallic and stale. He took a cautious step forward, half expecting the floor to give way beneath him. It held. The elevator doors remained open behind him, but when he glanced back, the interior seemed farther away than it should have been, as if the distance had stretched. The hallway ahead extended farther than the building's footprint should allow, disappearing into a dimness that swallowed detail. That was when he noticed the figures. They stood along the walls, partially obscured by shadow, arranged with a deliberate spacing that felt ceremonial. At first glance they looked like silhouettes, but as his eyes adjusted, details emerged. Faces pale and indistinct, eyes catching the weak light, clothing that resembled office, attire from different decades, styles overlapping in a way that made it impossible to place them in a single time. None of them moved, yet he felt their attention settle on him with tangible weight. The most unsettling part was not their stillness, but their expressions, a collective look of recognition that landed in his chest like a dropped weight. One of them stepped forward, the movement slow and careful, as if constrained by invisible rules. The figure's face sharpened into focus, and he recognized it with a jolt of disbelief. It was the young man from the footage, the one who had entered the elevator checking his phone, now altered by the environment, but unmistakable. His eyes met the guards, and something like relief crossed his features, quickly followed by resignation. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped, glancing upward toward the flickering lights, and shook his head almost imperceptibly. A pressure built in the guard's skull, a sense of being observed not just by the figures, but by the space itself. He realized then that the hallway was not merely a place, but a state. A layer folded alongside the building he knew, accessible only through the elevator's precise ritual. The figures were not trapped in the conventional sense. They were held, paused at a point just beyond ordinary reach. As the elevator chimed behind him, a warning rather than an invitation, the guard understood that his presence here was an error that would soon be corrected, and that whatever recognized him in the shadows was already adjusting to account for him. The answers did not arrive all at once, nor did they announce themselves with clarity. But after the night he stepped into the decayed reflection of the building, the guard could no longer ignore the weight of implication pressing in on every detail he had previously dismissed. Sleep became fragmented, invaded by images of flickering corridors and familiar faces locked in stillness, and when he returned to work, the building felt less like a workplace and more like a document he had not finished reading. He began with the archives, not the digital ones that had already proven unreliable, but the physical records stored in a climate-controlled room few people remembered existed. The keys were old, their teeth worn smooth by decades of use, and the shelves inside smelled of dust and paper that had absorbed secrets rather than light. What he found there did not contradict the building's official history, so much as slip beneath it. The earliest plans showed a different structure entirely, a sprawling complex with a footprint that extended beyond the current tower's foundation. The names attached to the documents were unfamiliar, the language clinical and euphemistic, referring to departments rather than purposes. Patient intake, behavioral observation, corrective isolation. The dates aligned with a period the city rarely discussed, a time when certain institutions were quietly shuttered and their records sealed under the guise of reform. There was no single document that stated what had happened, only gaps where explanations should have been, revisions that removed entire wings without comment, and a final note authorizing demolition followed, almost immediately, by approval for new construction on the same site. As he traced the evolution of the plans, one feature persisted across every version, even as floors were renumbered and layouts simplified. The elevator shaft. It appeared unchanged, its dimensions fixed with unusual precision, its materials specified in greater detail than any other part of the structure. In one early blueprint, annotated in a different hand, the shaft was described not as a means of transport, but as a transition corridor, language that had no place in conventional architecture. Later revisions struck out the phrase, replacing it with something mundane, but the measurements remained identical, as if the design could not be altered without compromising some underlying requirement. The guard's research led him beyond the building, into municipal records and zoning hearings, where the past surfaced reluctantly. Testimonies referenced an institution that operated under multiple names, each one abandoned after attracting the wrong kind of attention. There were mentions of experimental treatments, of individuals deemed unsuitable for release, yet inconvenient to keep. The language grew vaguer the closer he got to the truth, as if the records themselves were trying to forget. One transcript described a containment failure, not violent but structural, an incident in which several subjects were declared missing despite being accounted for moments earlier. The explanation offered was clerical error, the kind that dissolved under scrutiny but persisted through repetition. It became clear that the building was not merely constructed over the ruins of that place, but incorporated them, repurposing what could not be destroyed. The foundation plans showed reinforced sections where no load-bearing support was necessary, walls thickened around spaces that no longer appeared on any map. The elevator shaft intersected these anomalies at precise angles, threading through them like a needle passing through layered fabric. The realization settled slowly, heavy and undeniable. The elevator had not been added to the building. The building had been added around the elevator. Further confirmation came from an engineer's notebook, tucked into a misfiled box, its pages filled with calculations that did not correspond to vertical movement alone. Diagrams illustrated vectors that angled away from standard axes, annotated with notes about lateral displacement and phase alignment. The language was technical, but carried an undercurrent of caution, references to timing windows and stabilization thresholds that suggested a system operating on principles intentionally obscured. One passage described the risk of exposure if synchronization failed, warning that occupants might experience overlap rather than transfer, a phrase the guard did not want to imagine too deeply. The elevator's nightly journey began to make a different kind of sense. It was not descending or ascending in the traditional sense, but shifting, sliding into a parallel alignment where the erased institution still existed in a state of arrested decay. Midnight was not symbolic, but practical, a moment when environmental interference was minimized, when human activity dropped low enough to allow the transition to occur without disruption. The people who entered alone were not selected at random, but by proximity and timing, their presence sufficient to complete a cycle that had been running quietly for decades. The most disturbing discovery came from a classified addendum attached to the demolition approval. Its pages marked with warnings that had been ignored. It acknowledged that certain structures could not be fully dismantled, that attempts to do so resulted in unpredictable spatial anomalies. The recommended solution was containment through integration, building over and around the problem until it became functionally invisible. The elevator was described as a control mechanism, a way to manage the residual effects by allowing periodic exchange, though the language avoided specifying what was being exchanged or why it was necessary. With this knowledge, the guard revisited the surveillance footage in his mind, the calm expressions, the lack of resistance. If the elevator was doing what it was designed to do, then fear would have been counterproductive. The system required compliance, not force, and it had been calibrated to provide just enough disorientation to prevent panic while ensuring completion. The figures he had seen in the decayed hallway were not victims in the traditional sense. They were remnants, held in a lateral state because something had to remain there to balance what was allowed to leave. By the time he closed the final folder and returned the keys, the guard understood that the building was not haunted by accident or negligence, but by design, its glass and steel facade masking a compromise made long ago. The elevator did not malfunction because it was not meant to operate solely within the rules of the visible world, and the erased institution was not gone because erasure had been incomplete. The system persisted, precise and patient, and now that he understood its purpose, he could no longer pretend that knowledge alone would exempt him from its logic.